Hello, everybody. Let me first thank those who are associated with the Grand Rapids World Literature Forum, and I'm particularly indebted to Mike Zeta for the various ways in which he has assisted me, supported me, while I also thank Philip Ballesteros and Greg Hatt for their support at more levels than one. So, I've been asked to talk about Rabindranath Tagore and his works. And I think I would do well to make a few preliminary, even space-clearing remarks about the dimensions and direction of my lecture on Tagore this afternoon, while also registering a caveat at the outset. Well, it's simply impossible for me to traverse the entire range, staggering as it is, of Tagore's works. And to say that the range is staggering is just simply an understatement. But I intend to introduce Tagore relatively briefly and quickly at certain, if not all, levels, keeping in mind, however, how Tagore has been exoticized, romanticized, mystified, and even has been under the Orientalist gaze, if not totally, either deified or demonized in the West. In point of fact, Tagore tends to be reckoned more a mystic or even a spiritual guru, as if Tagore is out there to serve the spiritual needs of those yoga and Zen and meditation obsessed yet hamburger fetishizing Americans and Westerners. Now, while introductory in level, in nature, my lecture would also focus on certain crucial conceptual configuration and certain aspects and axes of Tagore's works that I argue have hitherto remained relatively uncharted or even ignored. Moreover, I intend to highlight certain conceptual configurations, other conceptual configurations, ones that again have remained, ignored, as well as I want to highlight certain conceptual stalemates in traditional Tagore criticism, while dwelling on a constellation of concerns that clearly attest to the challenging complexity of a canonical literary figure like Rabindranath Tagore himself. And the process of canonizing Tagore is not a unidirectional, but an overdetermined process, a process that I will symptomatically point up by way of recounting a relatively recent event. And the event is this: Shakespeare and Rabindranath Tagore have been brought together not only through the protocols of Eurocentric comparative literary criticism, but also through a recently erected statue. Indeed, there is now an impressive bronze bust of Tagore in Stratford-upon-Avon, a market town in England, and famous as the birthplace of none other than Shakespeare himself. The story doesn't end there. Tagore's own poem on Shakespeare remains inscribed on the pedestal in the original Bengali with Tagore's own English translation. In his poem, Tagore is very close to worshipping Shakespeare. That, of course, doesn't come as a surprise, for we have seen how Tagore, despite his commendable anti-colonial positions and practices in a number of instances, also excels in paying tribute after tribute to the West. And when Tagore, noted as he is for his magnanimity, pays his tributes, they are characteristically glowing, always sunny. And in turn, the West, rehearsing and reenacting its long, powerful tradition of appropriating and even plundering the resources, economic and cultural, of the, within quote, Oriental other, has made effective use of Tagore. Surely it is useful that a poet from the East, one who has both iconic value and exchange value in the economy of knowledge production and circulation, vouches for Shakespeare's greatness. So, can the West and the East meet? That is a question that gets routinely raised by liberals. Well, I would say they can. Of course, here the categories West and East are not to be taken as fixed geographical entities, but they point out unequal power relations. So the question, can the West and the East meet? They can. In fact, they have met again and again and again in and through the history of colonialism itself. And they keep meeting today through what has come to be known as globalization, which has become a buzzword, which is actually a euphemism for the latest stage of imperialism. But both the meeting and the mediation have never been easy and innocent. The East and the West have been deeply imbricated in unequal power relations, a point that I just made. It is because of such relations, among many other factors of course, that Tagore can easily be pressed into the service of Shakespeare's already established greatness. That Tagore also achieves his greatness only in relation to or in the company of Shakespeare himself, as if Shakespeare were the ultimate measure of everything that's great. That our Qazi Nazrul Islam turns out to be the Whitman of Bangla literature, that some of our so-called native intellectuals also feel accomplished and even proud when they find some connections between the Western canonical authors, or say Anglo-American European literary stars, and their Eastern counterparts. That being said, let me now move in the direction of charting out some other trajectories that would tell us who Tagore is. Surely, one continues to marvel at the sheer range of Rabindranath Tagore's preoccupations and achievements. A poet in the first place, Rabindranath Tagore is also a short story writer, novelist, playwright, essayist, critic, literary theorist, philosopher, travel writer, biographer, lyricist, song composer, singer, actor, social reformer, teacher, pedagogist, organizer, magazine editor, spiritual leader, environmentalist, theologian, aesthetician, painter, art critic, musicologist, linguist, historiographer, and so on. True, one is simply hard-pressed to find any literary figure in the 20th century who can simply match up to Tagore's phenomenal breadth and range. Let me quickly provide some examples of the variety of Tagore's preoccupations and pursuits outside his privileged domain, namely poetry, pursuits and preoccupations that I hope reveal a relatively unknown Tagore. Mark this then. In as early as 1911, while writing about historiographical trends in India, Tagore pointed out the limits of the Euclidean straight line and the pitfalls of linearity, something that hip postmodernists would find very interesting. In fact, the Indian subaltern historiographer Ranajit Guha has written an entire book called History at the Limit of World History, focusing on Tagore's own mode of historiographical thinking, among other things, while taking issue with the Hegelian notion of world history itself. And then Tagore writes about the parallels and certain interesting isomorphisms between mathematics and music, as he wrote about pharmacology and topology, including the role of hyperboles in shaping what the French meta-theorist of sociological knowledge Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus in another context. Also, Tagore has written about subjects as diverse as verses for children, the magic and miracle of zero, number zero, that is, Dante's Beatrice and Petrarch's Laura, even theories of jokes and humor, ethics, world literature, national literature, different aspects of environment, astronomy, semantics, optics, cosmology, mythology, agriculture, physics, and of course metaphysics, and so on and so forth. And this list is by no means an exhaustive one. He wrote more than 50 essays on education alone. I think the great Brazilian pedagogist Paulo Freire would have amply benefited from Tagore's works on education had Freire been familiar with those works. Although it is true that Freire's leftist position and Tagore's position do not always necessarily go hand in hand. I should also point out here that in 1934, Rabindranath Tagore wrote a short laudatory piece on the greatness of the Prophet Hazrat Muhammad as well as on the greatness of Islam. While in 1936, he did not hesitate to write another laudatory piece on George V, for instance. In addition, from his liberal humanist perspectives, Tagore writes critically about certain aspects of even capitalism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy. In 1905, Tagore ended up writing an entire essay, the title of which is just imperialism. Imperialism is this word, English word that Tagore uses directly in his title. The title itself is imperialism. Interestingly, back in 1892, Tagore wrote an essay called Socialism and yet another, Catholic Socialism. It was in the year in 1892 that Tagore wrote another essay called Amerikaner Rakto Pipasha in Bengali, and in English translation the title is The Bloodthirstiness of the Americans. Some of the conventional Tagore critics keep asserting that Tagore used an un-Tagoresque language in this particular piece, a piece in which of course Tagore squarely denounced what he himself called the, within quote, the genocidal tendencies of white Americans, unquote, and their racism as well, while unambiguously expressing his solidarity with the oppressed Native Americans and blacks in the United States. Now, this is the kind of Tagore, I submit, that does not get usually engaged here. But Tagore, sensitive and sympathetic as he is to the cause of the oppressed themselves, to the oppressed of the world, is also one of paradoxes, contradictions, gaps, illusions, absences, and silences. This is not to, in other words, well, Tagore gets questioned. It is here that I invoke the leading Bangladeshi thinker and writer Ahmed Safa, who back in 1994 raised quite a question in a thought-provoking essay called, in English translation, Had he been alive, I would have asked Tagore. I quote Safa here, quote, "Let me turn to my question then. There is no verbal conundrum here. It's a straightforward, simple question. Why didn't Tagore write a full-fledged story or a novel about his own Muslim subjects?" Well, this is not to suggest that Muslims do not appear at all in Tagore's works. Surely they do. They do in a variety of contexts. As a matter of fact, Tagore commendably wrote about the complex, fraught, tensed, problematic relationships between Hindus and Muslims in India at a very crucial, politically tossed conjuncture. But by Tagore's Muslim subjects, within quote, Safa of course means those poor, toiling Muslim peasants inhabiting the then East Bengal, which is today's Bangladesh, whose labor power, whose sweat and blood constituted the foundations of the exploitative zamindari system that by and large obtained and operated in the service of the colonial political economy in India. In other words, the mobilization of Safa's powerful category, Muslim subjects, constellates and reconstellates the question of class the question of unequal production relations, or for that matter, the question of political economy, the question of communalism, within quote, or the question of a kind of religion-based racism, and the question of what might be called ideological unconscious, questions that dialectically come together, if not always unproblematically intersect, to suggest that Tagore's liberal humanism in the final instance tends to exhibit certain tensions and limits vis-a-vis the radical question of structure rupturing equality at a given historical conjuncture within a given historic hegemonic bloc, to use Antonio Gramsci's famous term. And this is the kind of Tagore, I argue again, that Tagore worshipping critics in Bangladesh are not at all ready to engage. Well, I have hitherto tried to provide you with a sense of the variety and diversity of Tagore's preoccupations and pursuits. This variety, this diversity notwithstanding, in his own reckoning, Tagore is a poet in the first place. In many of his letters, Tagore almost characteristically did not sign his name at the end, but instead simply wrote Kobi, the Bengali word for poet. At the age of 8, he first tried to compose a poem, and even at 81, just a few hours before his death, he tried to compose nothing but a poem, his very last poem, one that he ended up dictating to someone. Tagore's first collection of poems, called Kobi Kahini, appeared in 1878, while his last volume of poems, called Janmodine, published during his lifetime, appeared in 1941, the year of his death. The journey from Kobi Kahini to Janmodine, a journey that eventfully spanned nearly 70 years, a journey that produced more than 60 collections of poems, was certainly one of a poet who also productively traversed numerous other territories with nothing short of superb consequences, broadening not only our literary but also our discursive horizon. And within this discursive horizon in question, one can readily locate Rabindranath Tagore's first major work, called Manushi, published in 1890. It is a volume of poems that, like Madhusudan Datta's groundbreaking literary epic called Meghnadbad Kabbo, inaugurated a new phase in the history of Bengali poetry. It is interesting that Madhusudan's epic appeared in 1861, the very year in which Tagore himself was born. True, Madhusudan exercised a tremendous impact on the subsequent generations of poets. It is not usually known that as many as 200 epics were attempted in Bengali after Madhusudan, although none of those epics could actually achieve the richness and rigor of Madhusudan's Meghnadbad, a monumental work in the history of Bengali literature. It is in this sense that Madhusudan had a large but a weak following. But Tagore's Manushi decisively revived, reshaped, and renewed the lyrical tradition in Bengali poetry, simultaneously linking up the very conjuncture of his poetic production with a vibrant lyrical tradition running from the Charjapad through the medieval Vaishnav lyrics and Chandidas to Lalan Fakir and Biharilal Chakraborty. And because of Tagore's unprecedentedly consequential interventions, it is the lyrical, not the epical, that has hitherto dominated Bengali poetry. Poetry remains at the forefront of Rabindranath Tagore's entire oeuvre. And Tagore characteristically celebrates the poetic in virtually every instance. On Tagore's 70th birthday, the popular fiction writer Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay famously characterized Rabindranath Tagore as a sovereign poet. For Tagore, indeed, poetry is ubiquitous. One can certainly invoke numerous essays of Tagore in order to account for his pronounced insistence on the poetic as a ubiquitous force. But for now, suffice it to recall his famous piece called Chandidas এবং বিদ্যাপতি, Chandidas and Vidyapati, a piece devoted to his most favorite poets, the medieval Bengali poets, a piece in which Tagore calls attention to the notion of the poetic itself. So, like Chandidas and Vidyapati, the poetic for Rabindranath Tagore resides in the very power to enter life itself, the life of the self, the life of the other, and the life of nature. And this triangular interaction, always aiming at some kind of grand unification, mostly animated by the Upanishads' mediated spirit of unity, characterizes at least part of Tagore's own poetics. And of course, alienation is mostly alien to this poetics, although it is true that some of his last poems, included for instance in Shesh Lekha, seem to be registering certain tropes of alienation, at least marking a kinda modernist moment in Bengali literature. But what comes to characterize Rabindranath Tagore's poetics is the Hegel-mediated notion of Einfühlung, one that literally means in feeling, one that emphasizes and even idealizes empathy and union, unlike the German playwright Bertolt Brecht's epic theatrical notion of Verfremdung, which means alienation. Indeed, Tagore is famous, some even say that he is notoriously famous for what is by now an established hermeneutic code in mainstream Tagore criticism, Oikko Chetona. Rabindranath Tagore's Upanishadian Oikko Chetona, the consciousness of unity as a principle, that is, as a pervading principle, that is, prompts him to forge connections among apparently different genres and forms. But still, it is the poetic that seems to be dominating in virtually every case, for it is characteristic of Tagore to weave the poetic into the discourses of fiction, non-fiction, plays, and even essays. Think of his novel called Shesher Kobita, or think of the short story called Ek Ratri, or think of such plays as Dagghar and Rakto Korobi and Raja, to mention just a few words at random, not to mention Chitrangoda. Of course, there are some essays in which Rabindranath Tagore exemplarily enacts a transaction between the prosaic and the poetic such that the borderlines between the two begin to blur. True, Tagore is famous for producing poetic prose and prosaic poetry, including what Bankim Chandra Chatterjee had first called Goddo Kobita, or prose poems in Bengali literature. Also, some critics who have detected what they call, I quote, the bubbles of the unconscious, unquote, in Tagore's works of painting, to be more specific, have also found in them at least some poetic registers and resonances refracted from those forms that are particularly dominated by visual images. Even in Tagore's poetics and aesthetics, even at the formal level, that is to say at the level of form, one thus sees that what the metaphysics of art accentuates as unity can certainly bring together or blend different formal, generic, and thematic elements. But then one also sees that this unity does not come to mean equality as such, that this unity is never a neatly resolved one or a completely achieved one, and that this unity may even involve some form of violence, one's well-meaning penchant for that very unity notwithstanding. We'll later briefly interrogate this very issue of unity at a political level. One thing that, in my reckoning, at least partially but significantly characterizes Tagore's work and world is his will to articulation. And it is this will to articulation that prompts and enables Tagore to seek and find words, notes, lines, even silences, genres, forms, media, and yes, all kinds of practices signifying or not. Even what we call thought, and what Rabindranath Tagore himself calls dhyan, which is not just thought, which is more than thought, and which is not just contemplation, but is more than contemplation, are all modes of articulation or signifying practices, ones that cannot, however, be dissociated from the world in which Tagore himself lived or acted or articulated. This is, of course, not to suggest that a writer's world just neatly comes to determine a writer's work as such. There are, in fact, complex lines of mediation. There are, therefore, connections, however tangential, between the word and the world, between the writer and his or her work and world. I quote, "The articulated is also worlded," unquote, as Rabindranath Tagore himself at least mildly indicated in several essays he wrote on language and literature. His well-known emphasis on the Bengali word shohit as the root of the Bengali word sahitya, meaning literature, is by no means pointless. It underlines the act of making connections as a crucial literary or signifying practice. In fact, Tagore anticipates the famous injunction of E.M. Forster, "Only connect." Although, as history tells us, the act of making connections is neither an innocent nor a safe one. Now, much has been written about Rabindranath Tagore over a period of more than 70 years since his death, while readers and critics were by no means silent, were rather vocal about Tagore's work even during his lifetime. In fact, one can rightly speak of a massive critical industry cashing in on the Tagore phenomenon that continues to attract all kinds of readings and rereadings. And my purpose here has not been to provide a comprehensive overview of Tagore's life and work, nor do I mean to offer a comprehensive critical evaluation of Tagore. Rather, I intend to take up further a few issues vis-a-vis certain positions that Tagore articulates in some of his prose works, issues that remain usually submerged or buried beneath the ritual of canonizing or even deifying Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore spent half of his life in the 19th century, from 1861 to 1900, and another half in the 20th, from the year 1900 to 1941. Indeed, just a few years before Tagore was born, in 1857, the first anti-colonial armed struggle for national liberation took place in British India, a movement that was more than a sepoy mutiny, a highly misleading, even a historical characterization that emanated from the British and their lackeys. And indeed, that movement turned out to be a material force spreading like fire and involving increasingly the insurrectionary participation of the masses, particularly including the peasantry. Of course, just a year before this movement, the famous Santal rebellion took place. In fact, one can trace a long history of all kinds of subaltern movements against British colonialism and the Zamindar class created by the British themselves. One can also simultaneously trace a history of brutal British repression of such movements, a history of colonial exploitation, oppression, tyranny, and violence. And colonial violence already assumed different forms: physical, political, economic, cultural, and even epistemic. Rabindranath Tagore was born at that explosive and violent conjuncture, while he himself witnessed the rise of a parasitic middle class, the consolidation of a colonial educational system, and the colonial bureaucracy and the politics of Congress, characteristically promoting the agendas of the British-dominated bourgeois, within quote, national bourgeois. Bourgeois is not fully formed, in the bourgeois, not in the classic sense of the term, but the bourgeois and feudal zamindar classes at the expense of the colonized majority. At the international level, on the other hand, capitalism, British, European, and even American, began to morph into monopoly capitalism or imperialism itself, the arc of whose development Lenin plotted with superb political rigor and efficacy in his classic work called Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism towards the beginning of the 20th century. Indeed, all such moments and milia variously surrounded the life and work of Rabindranath Tagore. And of course, during the second half of Tagore's life, history stubbornly shifted gears. The First World War, as a result of fierce inter-capitalist rivalries, the Russian Revolution of 1917 that gave rise to the world's first working class state, as well as heady socialist experiments while inspiring and influencing many other working class movements, including even national liberation movements across the colonized world, the national liberation movement in British India itself, and the brewing and growth of the Chinese Revolution throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, all constituted some of the crucial historical moments whose rhythms and pressures variously inflected or affected the world in which Tagore himself lived and worked. Now, by no means an aestheticist in the narrow sense of the term, but politically engaged and historically grounded in some profoundly significant ways, Rabindranath Tagore actively responded to certain conjunctural pressures of his time. His numerous political, social, educational, and philosophical essays amply attest to the point I have just made. Indeed, on more occasions than one, he directly took part in hard political activities, while he even addressed a few mass gatherings in British India. One often cites the case of his rejection of the British knighthood in protest against the colonial massacre in Amritsar. Even when Gandhi himself seemed silent and Chittaranjan did not move in the face of the massacre in question, it was none other than Rabindranath Tagore himself who protested in his own way the naked brutality of British colonialism itself. Yet, that protest and many other anti-colonial positions Rabindranath articulates in his work do not seem adequately strong or even sometimes fundamental in character. I think it is important to emphasize that his own class location and what might be called his own class unconscious or ideological unconscious, his Upanishadian Oikochetana, his unity-seeking metaphysics and aesthetics, and his brand of humanism, heavily influenced by Western liberalism. Tagore, yes, Tagore was one of the first and foremost liberals that British India produced after Raja Ram Mohan, variously inform his resistances, his responses and resistances to colonialism itself. In fact, Tagore's entire oeuvre is marked by both tensions and transactions with colonialism. More transactions than tensions, as some critics would have us believe. Numerous essays written by Rabindranath Tagore, of course, can be cited to see the point in question. But one can particularly look at such essays as Samajbhed, Prachyo Praticcho, Purbo o Paschim, and even Shabhyatar Shankar. These essays indicate that while it immensely pains Tagore to see the brutality of Western colonialism, his belief in the possibilities of so-called Western civilization remains more or less intact. In certain instances, Rabindranath even uncritically embraces the West, with his humanist ardor eliding or short-circuiting all unequal power relations that obtain and operate among different sites and subjects. We know that the rhetoric of Western humanism itself, in the name of love and compassion, and thus warmly embracing everyone on our planet, has historically ignored the actual sides of material contradictions and inequalities in an attempt to pacify or even preclude the possibilities of social uprisings against the oppressor. It is difficult to say that Tagore, at least in some of his works, has not been able to exercise, or has really been able to exercise, the ghost of Western humanism that still keeps recentering the West in a number of guises. Yes, the specters of colonialism keep haunting him. For instance, in his essay Purbo or Poshchim, an essay written after his rejection of the British knighthood, Tagore emphasizes the issue of humanity's grand union in the context of British India, while urging us to make our relationship with the West and the British a fruitful one, not by revolting against them, but by embracing them in our own interest. He even deploys the by now well-known colonialist metaphor of light to describe the civilizing role of the West in our life. Well, owing to time constraints here, I have to skip quite a cluster of interconnected observations and arguments, but let me quickly make some concluding points here. I think this particular essay, Purbo or Poshchim, among others, can easily be pressed into the service of today's neoliberal, neo-assimilationist project called US multiculturalism, one that emphasizes the grand union of all cultures. But of course, the overall position that Rabindranath Tagore enunciates in the essay vis-a-vis the West, by no means represents the totality of his positions and practices as such. There are other gaps, absences, and silences in his discursive engagements, while also there are telling moments of anti-colonial articulations and pronouncements that together turned Rabindranath into a highly contradictory and complex figure who nevertheless continues to open up spaces of promises and possibilities for us. Now, some last points, but by no means least. Any engagement with Rabindranath Tagore is likely to be an incomplete one, given the variety, breadth, and range of his preoccupations and pursuits, a point that I made more than once. But it is that in that incompletion that our further work begins. So, in the end, is there another kind of beginning? And that beginning can suddenly be made also in the interest of our own times, our own conjuncture, a conjuncture that is right now devastated by capitalism on the one hand, and also a conjuncture that is animated by all kinds of resistances to capitalism at this point. How do we read Tagore in this particular context is an important question. Another question that I think is important is this: which Tagore are we talking about? As a matter of fact, a few years back I wrote a Bengali essay, the title of which is Amra Kon Rabindranather Kotha Bolchi. Which Tagore are we talking about? And that very selection of Tagore is not ideologically innocent, not ideologically neutral. So any position that we tend to take vis-a-vis Rabindranath also has to do with the kind of politics that we are participating in. But at this point of time in history, Tagore returns to us in ways in which we can make use of Tagore in our attempts to relate Tagore to our ongoing struggles against all forms and forces of exploitation and injustice. Thank you very much for listening. It was a pleasure sharing my thoughts and ideas about Tagore with you all. So thank you.